Not quite, huh? Ah, damn. Smile was getting it.
Listen, man, you ain't gotta stop now. My mom's having a platter party tonight. Y'all wanna come check it out?
Now? Would you mind if I, too, checked it out? I've never been to North Avenue before.
Well, would it be safe? You know, for us?
Calm down, cracker boy. It's cool.
Being invited places by colored people feels so hip.
I'm glad y'all feel that way, cause not many people do. Y'all know what I'm saying?
Yeah, that's right.
I can't see why people look at me and only see the color of my face. Oh yeah. And there's those that try to help, God knows, but always have to put me in my place. But I won't ask you to be colorblind, cause if you pick the fruit, then girl, you should find the blacker the berry, the sweeter the juice. I could say it ain't so, but darling, what's the use? The darker the chocolate, the richer the taste. And that's where it's at. Now, baby, run and tell that. Oh, sugar, run and tell that. Hey, yeah, I can't see why people disagree. It's time I tell them what I know is true. Oh, no. See the world I'm from, I bet your heart is gonna feel it too. Yeah, now I could lie, but baby, let's be bold. Vanilla candy not ready, the truth be told. Blacker the berry, sweeter the juice. I can say it ain't so, but darling, what's the use? The darker the chocolate, the richer the taste. That's where it's at. Oh, baby, baby, run and tell that. Oh, sugar, go run and tell that. Get go on and run and tell that. Hey, hey, run and tell, go tell. Come on, baby, run and tell that. Hey, yeah. Yeah, 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 yeah. Hey, woo. Come here, girl. This is my sister, Lil Inez.
Oh, I know Tracy Turnblad. Good for you, girl. You got on the show. Well, you better be nice. You got that right.
Oh, you know she is. You better show her, girl.
I'm tired of covering up all my pride.
Give me some on the back inside.
I got a new way of moving and I got my own voice.
So how can I help but to shout and control?
Oh, the people out here can barely pay their rent. They're trying to make $1 out of 15 cents. We got a spirit, but it just came out. It's deep as a river, it's close to the sky, I can't see.
Reason it can't be the kind of world we all get our chance. Oh, yeah. So we can show 'em how. Just turn the music up and let's all dance, yeah. 'Cause all things are equal when it comes to love. Well, that ain't quite true. When it comes to shove, the blacker the berry, sweeter the juice. I can say it ain't so, but darling, what's the use? Darker the chocolate, richer the taste. And that's where it's at. Now, baby, 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 run and tell that. Run and tell that. Oh, baby, go run and tell that. Get, go down and run and tell that.
It was horrible. Mommy just danced on that bus with that great white whale and those Negroes.
Oh, honey, reeling him back in is the easiest thing in the world. Remember, I control his career. No. Now, don't worry. Mommy will take care of everything.